If you tried to sell one of your own kidneys in Texas today, you would be committing a state jail felony. Ask most people how long that's been true, and they'll assume forever. Selling your own organs sounds like exactly the kind of thing that's always been treated as a serious crime. They'd be wrong. For nearly 40 years, doing exactly that in Texas carried the same weight as a bar fight or shoplifting a bicycle. A Class A misdemeanor, capped at a year in county jail and a $4,000 fine. The felony charge on the books today didn't exist until September 2025. This is the story of how America first decided the human body couldn't be bought or sold, and how one state took 4 decades to actually treat that decision seriously. The idea that a person shouldn't be allowed to sell a piece of their own body is newer than it sounds. Kidney transplants had existed since the 1950s, but for decades the body's own immune system made long-term survival a coin flip. That changed once better anti-rejection drugs arrived in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Suddenly, far more patients could realistically expect a transplant to work, and the number of people who needed a kidney grew much faster than the number willing to give one away for free. In 1983, a Virginia physician named H. Barry Jacobs proposed a solution. He founded a company called International Kidney Exchange and announced, in an interview with the Washington Post, a plan to broker paid kidney sales. Healthy donors, including people recruited from developing countries, would sell a kidney for as much as $10,000, while Jacobs collected a broker's fee of $2,000 to $5,000 per transplant. The medical establishment reacted with alarm. The National Kidney Foundation accused Jacobs of turning informed consent into a formality. Congress took notice. Even then, the law wasn't a sure thing. The bill faced real resistance, not just from the Reagan administration, which worried about the cost of expanding federal involvement in healthcare, but from powerful medical groups like the American Medical Association and the American College of Surgeons. It passed anyway on a voice vote in both chambers, and on October 19, 1984, President Ronald Reagan signed the National Organ Transplant Act into law. Buried inside it, Section 301 made it a federal crime, punishable by up to 5 years in prison, to knowingly buy, sell, or broker the sale of a human organ for transplant anywhere in the United States. One doctor's failed business plan had permanently rewritten American law. That federal law is why selling an organ has been a felony everywhere in the country, including Texas, for over 40 years. But federal law was never the whole story. Because NOTA is federal, it applies the same way in all 50 states, but nothing stops individual states from layering their own criminal statute on top of it, giving prosecutors 2 different laws to choose from when they bring a case. Most states did exactly that in the years after 1984, and how seriously each one treated it varied enormously. Texas passed its own statute the very next year. Section 48.02 of the Texas Penal Code, added in 1985, made it a crime to knowingly offer to buy, sell, or otherwise transfer any human organ for money, with narrow exceptions for legitimate medical fees and for reimbursing a donor's travel, lost wages, or medical expenses. Doctors could still be paid for performing a transplant. Donors could still be reimbursed for travel, lost wages, and medical costs tied to the donation. What they could never do, under either law, was actually be paid for the organ itself, the line the whole statute exists to draw. The law defined human organ broadly, not just kidneys, hearts, and livers, but corneas, skin, and bone. On paper, it looked like Texas was standing shoulder to shoulder with the federal government. In practice, it did something much smaller. Texas classified its own version of the crime as a Class A misdemeanor, the same tier as many low-level assaults. Anyone charged only under state law without also triggering the tougher federal statute faced at most a year in county jail and a $4,000 fine. For 4 decades, that's where it stayed. That changed in 2025. State lawmakers, led by Senator Mays Middleton, introduced Senate Bill 456, arguing that a maximum fine of $4,000 was no real deterrent against organ trafficking, and that a misdemeanor didn't reflect the harm done to victims or to the integrity of the transplant system. One comment submitted to lawmakers put the math bluntly. A $4,000 fine was not a deterrent against a trade that can net brokers hundreds of thousands of dollars per transplant. It was closer to a cost of doing business. Public comments submitted to the Texas House described the crime in stark terms, that the human body must never be treated as a commodity, and that current penalties simply weren't taken seriously. The bill passed. Effective September 1, 2025, Section 48.02 was rewritten. Buying or selling a human organ in Texas became a state jail felony, carrying up to 2 years in state jail. The new law also added a consequence aimed at the medical system itself. Any physician found to have knowingly used an illegally obtained organ in a procedure must now have their medical license revoked. It wasn't the state's first attempt. A nearly identical bill had been introduced 2 years earlier in 2023, using almost the same language. Proof this gap had been on lawmakers' minds for a while before it was finally closed. Only offenses committed on or after the September 2025 date fall under the new felony. Anything earlier is still judged under the old, lighter law. None of this is theoretical. In July 2009, federal agents arrested Levi Isaac Rosenbaum, a Brooklyn broker who had spent 3 years arranging kidney transplants between paid donors from Israel and desperate recipients in New Jersey, charging as much as $150,000 per transplant while paying his donors a fraction of that. Rosenbaum wasn't operating in isolation. He was swept up in what was, at the time, the largest public corruption sting in New Jersey history, an investigation that also snared elected officials and religious leaders. He told an undercover informant in a recorded conversation that he was simply a matchmaker. Rosenbaum pleaded guilty in 2011 to violating the National Organ Transplant Act, the first person in American history convicted under that exact statute. In July 2012, a federal judge sentenced him to 2.5 years in prison and ordered him to forfeit more than $420,000. Texas's own version of the law reaches further than most people expect, too. In 2026, a man in Kyle, Texas, was arrested and charged under this same statute for allegedly attempting to sell a human skull on Facebook Marketplace. A reminder that the law covers bone and tissue, not just the organs people picture first. He now faces the same felony charge that before September 2025 would only have been a misdemeanor. One more sign of how much the new law has changed the stakes for anyone who runs afoul of it in Texas. The underlying debate hasn't gone away either. In 2021, a New Jersey man named John Bellocchio sued the U.S. Attorney General, arguing that the federal ban on organ sales violated his constitutional right to do what he wanted with his own body, and that legal compensation could save lives currently lost to organ shortages. Bellocchio, who runs a service dog business, said he'd become interested in selling a kidney after facing financial hardship, and was surprised to learn it was against the law at all. His attorney argued the ban violated his constitutional right to control his own property. A federal judge dismissed the case in 2022, and the law stood exactly as written. More than 100,000 Americans remain on transplant waiting lists, and by some advocacy groups' estimates, roughly 20 people on those lists die every day still waiting. Supporters of the ban argue that allowing organ sales would inevitably pressure the poor and desperate to sell pieces of themselves to the wealthy and sick. Organizations that manage today's donation system make a more specific version of that argument, that a paid donor has a financial incentive to hide health problems that a purely altruistic one wouldn't, putting recipients at medical risk. Opponents counter that banning compensation hasn't stopped exploitation at all. It simply pushed it into black markets like Rosenbaum's, where no one regulates the price or protects the donor. Texas didn't settle that argument in 2025. It simply decided that after 40 years of treating the question lightly, it was finally time to treat it like the felony the federal government had called it all along.